Hey everyone, I'm going to be doing a lineup review of this past week, week 8, going over my lineups. And since I had a big week, wanted to show my process. Since after all, obviously one of my lineups did extremely well, some of those still cash and others were duds. So I'm kind of going over how I created my lineups, for my core article. People that have been FTN subscribers, have seen these videos before. I used to do them more. But I'll still do them every now and then, kind of go over the process, especially when I have a big week. So this past week, what really did it for me was this Mariota stack. And something I want to be clear is this was a crazy scoring week. This might be very well my highest scoring lineup ever. I'm not really sure. It's not something I really pay attention to as total fantasy points. But 245 points is just insane. Like all these fire symbols is just so weird. But going in my article, something I always say about quarterbacks is, rarely do I use a quarterback in more than 20% of my lineups. So what I do is I create a bunch of stacks, and then I kind of integrate my core players into those lineups. And there's certain stacks that I have more of. Like in this case, I just had one Mariota lineup. It's not like I love Mariota. I did like Kyle Pitts. He was a core pick of mine, so I had Pitts in other lineups too. And I figured, well, if I have Pitts in all these lineups, I might as well have a game stack around him as well. So just kind of keep something to keep in perspective. I had about 15 lineups on DraftKings this week. That's a typical amount of lineups for me on the side. It's and somewhere in the 8 to 30 range. It really depends on the tournaments and how much money I'm putting in per lineup. For example, like next week, DraftKings has this $4,400 tournament with $1 million to first, and I love those tournaments. But obviously, I'm not going to put in 20 lineups. I'm not going to just drop $100,000 on one contest. So I'll have fewer lineups next week. Whereas this week, they didn't have that type of contest, and same thing with FanDuel. So I ended up doing close to like 15 to so lineups on each site. So, anyways, since I didn't have one, generally the quarterbacks I liked, I maybe did like 2 lineups with them. And then I would do one lineup of other random quarterbacks. And it ended up being the Mariota one that did well. And in this case, I decided to game stack it. I don't always game stack my stacks. Sometimes I'll just do, quarterback and a pass catcher, a quarterback and 2 pass catchers. This time I decided to do a quarterback and just 1 pass catcher, since it is Atlanta and they kind of spread the ball around, and Mariota also runs the ball, so he's not a guy that I would love to double stack with. That's why I didn't use Drake London as well. But I decided to bring it back in case the game got high scoring with 2 guys. And when I bring it back, it's always nice to do it with like a running back and a wide receiver. In this case, it was obvious choices with DJ Moore and Deontay Foreman. Sometimes I might just bring it back with 1 player, but in this case, I brought it back with 2. And that obviously worked out real well because all those guys did real well. And then I kind of rounded out the lineup with my core picks. Alvin Kamara was obviously my favorite pick of the week. And I mentioned that he'd be pretty popular at 18%. And sure enough, he was fairly popular, but I had him in more than half of my lineups. And then there was my reluctant chalk of Tony Pollard, who I maybe had in 40% of my lineups. But you can see I was actually under-owning him since he was in 2/3 of everyone else's. But I still had Tony Pollard in almost half my lineups, so he was in this one. And when it comes to some of these chalk guys, I was figured it's not like Mariota Pitts was going to be a popular stack, so I didn't really feel too worried about using chalky Tony Pollard in there. And then I kind of used, quite frankly, DeAndre Hopkins wasn't technically a core pick, but he kind of was. I mean, I had him in my cheat sheets. I had him in 40% of my lineups. And I talked about how much I like Kyler and Hopkins, so you read between the lines, he was basically a core pick. And then other than that, all I really had left was just had some extra salary. And I didn't really use Amon-Ra in that many lineups. He just kind of fit. So I just used Amon-Ra in the Cardinals defense. And you notice I had Hopkins and Cardinals. It's not like I intentionally stacked him. It's more like I didn't have any Vikings, so whatever. I just threw in the Cardinals defense. I really don't think much about defenses. I tend to just choose cheap ones or whatever. Sometimes I'll pair it with a running back, but I really don't put much thought into defense. And in this case, Amon-Ra he was my dud, and he wasn't the core pick, so it's kind of funny how that worked out. But let's go ahead and look at some of my other lines. Obviously, a little bit of skill and luck is what made this one did so well. But something I always want to give a perspective on is looking at the points differentials. As you can see, I clearly was higher than the third, but I was only a few points below first. And the first place guy, he's the Tua stack. Obviously, Tua is very popular, and otherwise he kind of used similar players as mine. He had Moore and Pitts and Kamara and Pollard and just kind of these like random other players. It's just something, it's kind of where the cookie crumbles sometimes. You can't really overthink these things because the dollar amounts between first, second, third, or fourth, whatever, becomes so high, but often it's just kind of random this and that really separates you. What you really want to do is put yourself on, make your lineup unique enough and weird enough and good enough, and kind of like high risk, high reward enough to where it can land in the top 10 and just hope it ends up being first or maybe second in this case. But let's go and look at some other lineups. In this case was a Cotto lineup. And again, I used Kamara and Pollard and Hopkins. And I didn't have DJ Moore in that many lineups, but I guess I had him in this one. I talked about Mooney in my my article. I had Mooney in a lot of my lineups. And he just, he didn't have a touchdown. And this was just a very unforgiving week because the points were so high. And obviously, my Dameon Pierce was a pick, and he didn't really do so well. The funny thing is, I think I had Tyler Conklin in this lineup before I had Foster Moreau. I wasn't huge on Tyler Conklin. It wasn't a core play. I just had him in like one or two lineups. But when I saw that Waller was out, I switched to Foster Moreau. And it wouldn't have mattered that much because he still would have been below my second place lineup. But it's just kind of funny how that worked out. But, you can see in this lineup, though, I did not have any bringbacks. This was just a skinny stack. I do that sometimes. I don't always do a game stack like I did in the first lineup. You don't have to always game stack. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Here we go. This is funny. A Zach Wilson stack ended up being my third best one. I think I made this after the show. I guess we talked about Garrett Wilson some and about how low owned Elijah Moore would be. And guess what? Elijah Moore played 10 snaps, so that kind of dudded out this lineup. But again, it was a very unforgiving week. Like everything, all these other guys. I mean, Tyler Conklin was the man. I talked about him not in this week's, but in the previous week's article to a tight end to look out for. And with Elijah Moore gone, he's just getting more receptions. And I thought he was gonna be back. That's why I put him on my lineup, but clearly he's not. I'm just wasting space. And in terms of running backs, I talked about CMC on the show. How much I liked him too. He wasn't in the core article, but I think he was in the cheat sheets. And we talked about him on FTN Live a lot. But Jonathan Taylor was also another one, and he was my dud of the week. So, instead of Elijah Moore, I have Kamara and someone else, and all of a sudden this could have took the whole thing down. That's just how lineup making works. But again, in this lineup, it was just a massive Jets onslaught. There was no one from New England back. So I don't always game stack, but sometimes I do. In this case, in this Justin Fields lineup, who I talked about a lot, I did game stack it. Sometimes in this case, I brought it back with both Pollard and Lamb. Sometimes I just brought it back with Pollard or just Lamb. I didn't always game stack, total game stack, but obviously Pollard was the better choice because of all his rushing touchdowns. And then I just filled it out with core players. Again, Kamara was great. Taylor, not so much. Deontay Johnson, not so much. That's just kind of my style in terms of making lineups. I start with a stack. Some of the stacks are, in my article, but, I always have more of them. I had, in this case, I had one Tua stack. I had one Stafford stack. It's just, we could talk about the Stafford lineup a little bit here. So again, I decided to go with the Stafford, and with Higbee and Kupp, and in this case, this is the only lineup I had Higbee and Kupp in, right? And I brought it back with CMC, who I have in other lineups, but that's just kind of the core base, and then I integrated core plays of Pollard and Mooney, and then I had some filler, and I just went with I didn't have much cap left, so I went with Garrett Wilson, who was cheap and good, and then Chris Moore, who he talked about on the show. I had him, like 2 lineups, and this was one of them, and he was a total dud. So, but that's just kind of how my process works. I have I'm not a 150 lineup guy. I am a multi-entry guy, but I'm not a max multi-entry guy. Somewhere in the, call it 8 to 30 lineups, and I use a variety of quarterbacks, and the quarterbacks I like more, I use in more lineups, and then I stack around them. Sometimes I game stack more than others, and then I integrate core plays, and every now and then I have like an extra spot who I throw in a random guy. In this case, surprisingly, my Jalen Hurts lineup just didn't do so well. Obviously, Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown are great, but then I used Pickens as a bring back, which I guess because of salary, and that was not good. And then everything else just kind of sucked besides Kamara. I thought this was an interesting lineup idea. My idea behind this was if Pollard chalk was bad, this would be one of the few lineups with Jalen Hurts and like high, expensive running backs. So the idea was like Taylor and Kamara may have been good, and all the other running backs were bad. And then this lineup, that was, it was an interesting idea, right? It just obviously did not work. And then you can kind of see, I got one Daniel Jones lineup, and then we start getting to this is my second Kyler Murray lineup. In this case, I did bring it back with Thielen, and I double stacked it with Eno Benjamin and Hopkins. And I really underowned Raheem Mostert this week. I had him a little bit, just not that much, which was a good thing because he did not do well. So, and this was another one of the few lineups that had Chris Moore in. So, hopefully, I'm kind of showing you my lineup process, and you can see how I have the same thoughts this week, and I had scores between 106 and 245. Even though I'm using a lot of the same players throughout the thing. I made this. This is my Alex lineup after the show. I decided to go with Malik Willis and then Swift and Mostert. It made sense on the show, but as you can see, it did not work out so well. And again, Jonathan Taylor did not work out so well, but Hopkins was good. Again, filling out with, these wide receivers were all kind of like core-ish wide receivers with Johnson, Mooney, Hopkins. So you can see how kind of the same thought processes can lead anywhere from 100, 130 points to 245 points. And that's why I go with a mix of stacks, a mix of bringbacks with those stacks, and integrate the core plays, because that way, if some of my core plays just really kill it, like I did with Kamara and Hopkins and Pitts, that way you kind of set yourselves up for a chance to win. If obviously some of my other core plays don't do so well, and one of my stacks does well, one of the stacks doesn't do well, it's always having that right pairing. And when you have more of the right core plays that week, the higher the chance I have of winning. And this week, I kind of hit it on the head with Kamara and Pitts and not fading Pollard and Hopkins. And then it was just a matter of if all the other random parts of the piece fell into play. And, I got lucky with all those late game endings there with the Falcons game. So anyways, I hope this kind of helps you out, kind of understanding my lineup making process and kind of my stack making process. And something I just want to kind of reiterate is, everyone's asked me, do you bring back one guy? Do you bring back two guys? How many people per stack? And I just want to make it clear there's no right answer. It's a mix. It depends. And if the answer was always the same thing, then DFS wouldn't be any fun and it wouldn't be beatable. Because you have to ask you have to kind of, lineup making is kind of it's a process and it's an art. You can't just do the same type of lineup every single time. Sometimes you want a game stack, sometimes you just want a skinny stack. Sometimes you want a skinny one side and, heavy the other side. It's up to you, and it's, week by week and kind of which players fill their salaries and stuff like that. So anyways, hope that all helps. And I think something I've made clear throughout my process is I really don't put any thought into the defense. That is always the last thing, and it's always just based on how much money I have left. I like having a variety of defenses, but in general, I don't really think about the defense at all. So, anyways, hopefully we all have a good week 9, and we'll talk again soon.